Chosen one, there is a word being released from heaven over your life today that directly confronts the most devastating conclusion that your most difficult seasons have attempted to write over your story. It is a word that arrives not as a gentle encouragement for someone navigating a minor inconvenience, but as a bold and authoritative declaration from the throne room of God for someone who has stood in the middle of circumstances that used every piece of available evidence to argue that certain chapters of their life had been permanently and irrevocably closed. You have faced situations that looked final, not temporarily difficult or seasonally challenging or delayed beyond expectation. Final, the kind of final that has the weight of multiple confirming pieces of evidence behind it. The kind of final that even the most faith-filled people in your life began to quietly accept when the visible evidence for it accumulated beyond what hopeful reframing could reasonably address. The kind of final that settled into the atmosphere of your situation with a heaviness that made even your own prayers feel like they were reaching against an immovable conclusion rather than toward an open heaven. And the enemy took those situations that looked final, and he went one step further. He did not just allow the appearance of finality to speak for itself. He amplified it. He labeled it. He declared over the specific areas of your life where the visible evidence was most discouraging that what you were seeing was not just a season of difficulty, but an impossibility. He gathered every resource available to him, and he built the most persuasive case he could that what was broken could not be mended, what was lost could not be recovered, what had ended could not begin again, and what looked impossible was, in his declaration, genuinely beyond the reach of any intervention, including divine. Today, heaven is responding to every one of those declarations with a counter-declaration of such absolute authority that nothing the enemy has said or built or constructed in your situation can withstand its weight. God is rewriting what looked final, and he is restoring what the enemy called impossible. The nature of divine rewriting to fully receive what this declaration means for your specific situation. Chosen one, it is important to understand what it means for God to rewrite something that looked final. Because rewriting is not the same as editing or revising or improving upon what was previously written. Rewriting is a more fundamental and more comprehensive act than any of those lesser interventions. When a human author revises a story, they work within the constraints of what has already been established. The characters remain the same, the foundational narrative elements remain in place. The revisions happen at the level of detail and direction without fundamentally altering the nature of what the story is. This is the level at which human effort attempts to address the situations in our lives that have produced conclusions of finality. We revise, we adjust, we work within the constraints of what has already been established, and we attempt to improve outcomes while operating within the boundaries of what the visible evidence suggests is possible. But when God rewrites, he does not work within the constraints of what the previous narrative established. He is not limited by the conclusions that the accumulated evidence of difficult seasons has produced. He is not bound by the logical endpoints that natural cause and effect would suggest are the inevitable outcomes of the situations your life has walked through. When God rewrites, he picks up the pen of divine sovereignty and he writes something categorically new over the situation, not a revision that works within the old framework. A rewrite that establishes an entirely new framework from which the story of your life continues. This is what happened when Lazarus was 4 days dead in the tomb. By every natural framework of what was possible, the story of Lazarus had reached its final chapter. Death is the most conclusive human experience of finality, and 4 days of death carried such complete natural finality that even Martha, a woman of significant faith who had been close to Jesus, responded to his arrival with the specific resignation of someone who had already accepted the final nature of what had happened. She said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Past tense, finished. The story of Lazarus, written in her understanding, is concluded beyond the possibility of reversal. Yet Jesus stood before the tomb and rewrote the story, not revised it, not improved upon the final chapter that death had written, rewrote it entirely, called a dead man out of a tomb, overrode the most absolute human framework of final with the declaration that his story was not finished, regardless of what the 4-day-old visible evidence argued about its completion. That is the God who is rewriting your situation today, chosen one. The same authority that called Lazarus out of a 4-day tomb is the authority being applied to the areas of your life that looked final. And his rewriting is not limited by the constraints of what the visible evidence established as the natural conclusion of your story. What looked final in your life, chosen one? Let us speak honestly and specifically about the areas of your life where the appearance of finality has been most pressing and most difficult to stand against with faith. Because the declaration that God is rewriting what looked final is not a general statement about vague difficulties. It is a specific and targeted word directed at the specific conclusions that your most challenging seasons have attempted to establish over your story. Perhaps what looked final was a relationship, a marriage that reached a point of such profound disconnection or such deeply wounding history that everyone who knew the situation had quietly accepted that reconciliation was beyond the reach of any intervention. A family bond that fractured under the weight of betrayal or misunderstanding or prolonged conflict until the gap between the people involved grew so wide that crossing it seemed to require more grace than any human situation could realistically access. A friendship that ended in a way that left wounds so specific and so deep that even the desire for restoration felt like wishful thinking in the face of what the ending actually cost. Perhaps what looked final was a dream or a calling, a vision for your life that you carried with extraordinary faithfulness through seasons of development and preparation and investment until something happened that stripped it away and left you standing in the wreckage of what you had built toward, trying to make sense of an ending that the effort invested in the dream made feel profoundly unjust. The specific grief of a finished dream is different from other griefs because it takes not just what was, but what was going to be. It takes the future as well as the present. Perhaps what looked final was a health situation, a diagnosis or a physical condition that medical wisdom declared permanent or progressive or beyond the reach of any treatment that current understanding could offer. The particular weight of a health conclusion of finality is its intimacy. It does not just affect a circumstance or a relationship or a dream. It lives in your body. It presses against the physical vessel of your daily experience with a constancy that makes every moment of every day an encounter with what the conclusion declared was beyond reversal. Whatever the specific area where finality has pressed most heavily in your life, chosen one, the declaration that God is rewriting it is directed precisely and personally at that area. He is not rewriting someone else's conclusion while leaving yours in place. He is rewriting yours, the specific one, the one that has carried the most weight, the one that the enemy has most invested in declaring beyond restoration. That is the one that today's declaration is addressing. The impossible things God specializes in the second dimension of today's declaration addresses what the enemy called impossible. And this language deserves its own careful examination, because impossibility is the enemy's most comprehensive and most final category of opposition. When he moves a situation from difficult to impossible in his declaration, he is attempting to move it beyond the reach, not just of human effort, but of divine intervention. But chosen one, the enemy's definition of impossibility has a fundamental flaw that his entire strategy of declaring things impossible is built upon, and that his declarations consistently fail to account for. His definition of impossible is bounded by the limits of what natural cause and effect can produce. He declares things impossible because they exceed the reach of human ability to accomplish or natural processes to generate. And within those boundaries, his declaration of impossibility is often accurate. But God does not operate within the boundaries of what natural cause and effect can produce. He operates from a position of sovereignty over every natural process and every natural law and every natural boundary that the word impossible points to. What is impossible within the constraints of the natural order is not impossible for the one who created the natural order and who maintains the sovereign authority to operate outside of its constraints whenever the purpose he has determined requires it. This is precisely what the angel declared to Mary when she asked how she could conceive a child without the involvement of a man. The angel's response was not a biological explanation. It was a declaration of principle. With God nothing shall be impossible. Not some things, not most things, nothing. The category of divine impossibility is empty. There is nothing that God has declared He will do that the constraints of natural impossibility can prevent him from doing. The impossible things the enemy declared over your life fall into this category. He declared them impossible using the accurate measurement of what natural processes and human effort could produce. And by that measurement he was right. What he declared impossible in your life genuinely is beyond the reach of natural process and human effort. But the God who is restoring what the enemy called impossible is not working from within the constraints of natural process and human effort. He is working from the position of sovereignty over every constraint the enemy's definition of impossible was built upon. He specializes in the impossible, the empty womb of Sarah, the parted waters of the Red Sea, the dry bones of Ezekiel's valley, the resurrected body of Jesus Christ. These are not isolated exceptions to a God who generally works within natural constraints. They are the consistent pattern of a God whose nature is to do what the enemy has called impossible in the lives of chosen hearts who refuse to release their faith in his ability to do what every natural measurement declares cannot be done. Your impossible situation is his specialty, and the restoration of what the enemy declared impossible in your life is already underway. How God rewrites in real-time, chosen one. Let us talk about the practical reality of how God's rewriting of what looked final and restoration of what looked impossible manifests in the actual experience of a chosen life. Because understanding this will help you recognize the rewriting that is already happening even before it has reached the point of obvious and dramatic visibility. God rewrites through the arrival of information that reframes the situation. What looked final often looked final because the information available to you was incomplete. You were evaluating the conclusion based on what was visible from your position. But God has access to information about your situation that your position does not allow you to see. And part of how he rewrites is through bringing that additional information into the visible realm in ways that fundamentally change how the situation reads. A medical report that contradicts a previous diagnosis. A conversation that reveals dimensions of a broken relationship that the surface story did not contain. A development in a situation that shows the conclusion you were standing before was not as established as the visible evidence suggested. God rewrites through the arrival of people carrying pieces of the rewriting. Part of the restoration of what looked impossible comes through specific people who carry specific gifts, specific resources, specific wisdom, or specific connections that were not previously available to your situation, and whose arrival in your path changes what is possible within it. These people are not coincidences. They are pieces of the rewriting being assembled by God and placed in your path at precisely the moments their contribution to the restoration is most needed. God rewrites through the unexpected transformation of what seemed immovable. Relationships that seemed permanently fractured begin showing unexpected signs of softening. Situations that seemed completely fixed in their final form begin demonstrating flexibility that no previous evidence suggested was available. Medical conditions that seemed beyond the reach of improvement begin responding to treatments or to divine intervention in ways that contradict the conclusion of permanence that was declared over them. These unexpected movements in previously immovable situations are the surface expressions of the divine rewriting happening in the spiritual dimension that precedes visible manifestation. And God rewrites through the specific peace he places in the spirit of a chosen heart that is standing in the middle of a situation that still looks final from the outside. A peace that has no natural explanation given the circumstances. A settled confidence in the spirit that something is changing even when nothing visible has yet changed. This peace is not denial or emotional disconnection. It is the spirit of a chosen heart receiving the signal from the spiritual realm that the rewriting has begun, that the restoration is underway, that what looked final is being rewritten, and what the enemy called impossible is being restored by hands whose authority over every situation is absolute, and whose faithfulness to every promise is without exception. The dry bones that breathed again, chosen one. There is perhaps no more powerful biblical portrait of God restoring what the enemy called impossible than the vision God gave to the prophet Ezekiel in the valley of dry bones. The vision is so specific and so dramatic in its portrayal of divine restoration of what looked utterly and finally dead that it deserves careful meditation in light of what God is declaring over your situation today. God brought Ezekiel to a valley and caused him to walk among an enormous collection of bones, dry bones, not recently deceased remains that retained some possibility of restoration. Dry bones, bones that had been in that valley long enough to be stripped of every vestige of the life they once contained. Bones representing situations so thoroughly and so completely finished that the question God asked Ezekiel as he caused him to walk among them was almost rhetorical in its apparent absurdity. Can these bones live? The honest, natural answer to that question is no, they cannot. They are not recently dead. They are not partially alive. They are not in a state of suspended animation awaiting the right intervention. They are dry. Their dryness is the evidence of the finality of their condition and the length of its duration. By every natural measurement available, the answer to God's question is clearly and obviously and irreversibly no, yet Ezekiel did not give the natural answer. He gave the faith answer. He said, "O Lord God, you know." And in that response, he placed the question of impossibility back in the hands of the only one whose answer to it actually mattered. Not the answer of natural measurement, not the answer of accumulated visible evidence, not the answer of the enemy's declaration of impossibility. The answer of the God who created the bones in the first place, and whose creative authority over them was not diminished by the dryness of their current condition. God told Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones, to speak the word of restoration to what looked so thoroughly and completely finished that speaking restoration to it must have felt like the most audacious act of faith Ezekiel had ever been asked to perform. And as the prophetic word went out to the dry bones, breath came into them. They came together, flesh came upon them. They stood up, an exceeding great army, where there had been a valley of impossibly dry and finished bones. This is the pattern of how God restores what the enemy called impossible. He speaks. He causes his chosen servants to speak. And the word of restoration spoken into the valley of dry bones produces the breath of new life in situations that every natural measurement had classified as beyond the reach of any revival. Your valley of dry bones is not beyond this. Your specific situation that the enemy declared impossible is not exempt from the pattern that Ezekiel's valley established. The same God who caused dry bones to stand as an exceeding great army is the God rewriting your story and restoring your impossible right now, receiving the rewriting chosen one. As this message reaches its conclusion, there is a specific and important response that this declaration invites from you. Not passive reception of a promise without personal engagement. Not striving to produce through human effort what only divine intervention can accomplish, but the active and faith-filled cooperation with the rewriting that God has already initiated in your situation. Speak the rewriting rather than the final conclusion. Every time your mouth declares what God is doing in your situation, rather than what the visible evidence argues about it, you are cooperating with the divine rewriting in the most direct way available to you. The enemy maintains the appearance of finality, partly through the agreement of the voices around his declarations. When your voice withdraws its agreement from his conclusion and directs itself toward the truth of what God is declaring, the spiritual atmosphere over your situation shifts in ways that accelerate the manifestation of the rewriting. Position yourself to receive the rewriting by maintaining your presence at the threshold of the promise. The dry bones of Ezekiel's valley did not move toward Ezekiel. He moved among them. He went to where the impossible situation was, and he spoke the word of restoration directly into it. Do not retreat from the area of your situation that looked final. Remain present. Keep speaking the promise. Keep praying into the specific area where the enemy's declaration of impossibility has been loudest. Your continued presence and continued faith speech at the exact point of the apparent finality is a cooperation with the divine rewriting that God honors with accelerated movement toward the visible expression of what he has already determined to restore. And receive the peace that signals the rewriting has begun. When the specific and unexplained peace of God settles over an area of your life that previously produced only anxiety, receive it as the confirmation that the rewriting is already underway in the spiritual dimension, even before it has fully expressed itself in the visible one. That peace is heaven's signal that the story is being rewritten, that the impossible is being restored, that the pen of divine sovereignty is already moving over what the enemy called finished and writing what he declared could never be written. God is rewriting what looked final. He is restoring what the enemy called impossible. and the story of your life that emerges from this divine rewriting will carry the testimony of a God whose authority over every final conclusion and every declared impossibility is as absolute and as faithful and as completely unstoppable as it was when he called Lazarus out of a 4-day tomb and breathed life into Ezekiel's valley of dry bones. Type Amen if you receive this declaration today. Share this message with someone whose situation needs the encouragement of knowing that God is not finished writing their story, and that what the enemy called impossible is precisely the category that God specializes in restoring.